Good morning. Several months ago, a friend and I went on a little bit of a nerd adventure. Any nerds out there? You're my people. All right. We spent 5 glorious days in the Badlands of South Dakota hunting for a very elusive gemstone called the Fairburn agate. This is the kind of, there it is. This is the kind of landscape that we hiked through. This is like one of my very favorite places to be. Now, you should know that the Fairburn agate is an exceedingly rare gemstone and oftentimes will sell for hundreds of dollars. On average, you could expect to walk through maybe 8 or 10 hours of staring at the ground and maybe find one gemstone. Maybe. Early on our trip, I had some amount of luck, so here are a couple of the Fairburns that I found. Pretty amazing, pretty beautiful. But here's the deal. They weren't really top shelf Fairburn agates, and that's what we were after. So as time was running out and our quest was becoming a little more desperate, towards the end of our trip, we ended up at a place called Indian Creek. And this is thousands of acres of rugged wilderness, and it's accessed only by a good 4-wheel drive truck. And after we had crossed the river 7 times, we thought we were sufficiently in the middle of nowhere where no one else had ever looked for an agate. For the next several hours, we walked over countless millions of stones that looked increasingly the same with no luck at all. And at one point, I'm not going to lie, we were both pretty frustrated and discouraged. And at one point in searching that creek bed, I mentioned that maybe I'd pray to find a gemstone. Well, my friend plopped down in the middle of the rock bed, and we wondered aloud if that really was an appropriate prayer or not. And I told him a story about a time in my own faith life, early on as a new believer. And I don't remember the circumstances exactly, but I found myself in a room with the senior pastor and the associate pastor of the church we were going to at the time. And the younger pastor was explaining about a golf game that he'd had the day before that hadn't gone well. And at one point he teed up and he said a prayer, "Lord, make this shot go true and straight and land right on the green." And the senior pastor interrupted him somewhat impatiently and said, "God doesn't care about your golf game." And then they proceeded to have this very robust theological conversation, argument whether that was true or not. Does God intervene in the smallest details of our lives? Does God delight in giving us delight in the small things? These two faith leaders came down on opposite sides of this question. And I think a question like this can really influence our view of God. So there we were, sitting on that riverbank, and we were tossing around the idea whether it was okay to waste a prayer on finding a rock. I come down on the side of the argument that God really does care about the details of our lives, that God really does show up and intervene in our lives in obvious ways. And maybe some of you out there today disagree with me, and that's okay. But that afternoon, a couple of months ago in South Dakota, as we finished up our conversation, we stood up to resume our search. My friend looked down between his legs and he found this. This is a top shelf Fairburn agate. The variety is called a floater agate, and they're exceptionally rare. A guy could go his whole life without finding a gemstone like this. Now, I know that in the big picture, a prayer for a better golf game or a prayer to find a rock is inconsequential to God's greater purposes. But they're trivial stories, but I think they allude to a larger question, a larger truth. Does God care and sometimes intervene in the smallest details of our lives? Or is he a creator who set the universe into motion and he's just watching from a distance, detached, uncaring, uninvolved? So 5 weeks of our sermon series, we've recounted stories from the Old Testament that detail how God does show up in the lives of his people, how he intervened in big ways and in small ways. But how about us? How does our story and God's story intersect? Should we expect God to intersect our story like he does those in the Old Testament stories? Here's how I would distill that question. Are we part of God's redemption story? I think this is a really important question. It's important because if we answer that question with a resounding yes, then it binds us to the stories of the Old Testament. If the answer to this question is yes, then all who have put their allegiance in Jesus are part of a much greater cosmic story. And for the past 5 weeks, we have witnessed the extraordinary way that these ancient stories all point forward to Jesus Christ. The author and theologian Graham Goldsworthy, he puts it this way: we do not start at Genesis 1 and then work our way forward until we discover where it's all leading. Rather, we first come to Christ, and he directs us to study the Old Testament in the light of the Gospels. The Gospel will interpret the Old Testament by showing us its goal and its meaning. So here we are in week 6 of our sermon series called Sunday School for Grown-Ups, and this week we're going to look at the story of baby Moses. And for 5 weeks in a row, we have seen God show up in these stories in dramatic ways that leave no doubt in our minds. God showed up. He was seen, he was heard, he was felt, he acted in unmistakable ways. And we think, wouldn't it be nice if we saw more of that today in our own stories? Wouldn't it be great if God unmistakably showed up? But that isn't, well, it's not usually our experience, is it? And I think that's why this story today is helpful, because it's a little bit more like our own experience. You see, in the story of baby Moses, if we blink our eyes, we might miss God's intervention. First, I want to recap a little bit. So over the course of the sermon series, we built a case for God's redemption story. And for all of human history, that redemption story has been really a purposeful march to restore our relationship with God. How God from the very beginning has stepped into the lives of his people. And this is a theme that's really worked its way through all of Scripture. We might word it this way: God steps in and the story of redemption marches on. And we started in week 1 where it all started, in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. We talked about how they were made to live between the tree of life and the tree of wisdom. But we rejected God's authority, we rejected God's rule, and were banished from the garden. And God stepped in, and the story of redemption marches on. In week 2, we tackled the story of Noah, and at its core, it's a story of humanity getting exactly what it wanted. The arrogance that we witnessed in the garden spirals down into sin, and Noah hears the voice of God and acts in obedience and faith, and he builds the ark, and God steps in. And the story of redemption marches on. In week 3, we moved on to the story of the Tower of Babel. Come, let us build a tower that reaches to the heavens. And just like in the garden, when Adam and Eve rejected the rightful authority of God and turned to their own wisdom, instead, the Babel builders had the same outcome. And God steps in, and the story of redemption marches on. In week 4, we tackled the story of Abraham and Isaac, a cliffhanger story where father and beloved son set out on a God-given mission to sacrifice that son. Isaac, the son, carried the wood that would fuel the fire that would consume his body. And when all seemed lost, God intervened. He held back the knife. God himself provided the sacrifice. God, he stepped in. And the story of redemption marches on. And last week, we recounted the life of Joseph. How Joseph valued the plans and the purposes of God more than he valued his own plans and preferences. He was a truer and a clearer reflection of what God was like. And so this brings us to our story today. In our story of baby Moses, we might have to squint our eyes a little bit to see God intervening. And up to this point, all of our stories have taken place in the very first book of the Bible called Genesis. And today we're going to move out of Genesis to the second book called Exodus. So I encourage you to grab a Bible and follow along. Last week we left off with the people of God in a pretty great place. They were living a comfortable life. Joseph had been in a position of power that set them up to be respected by the Egyptians. They had their own land to farm and raise their own family. Life was good. Do you remember our sermon thesis? Let's wonder like children and read like adults. So I thought we'd do that today. I thought we would wonder like children. So I don't tell Pastor Rob, but I swiped this from Kids Ministry. This is the story of Moses. Let's read and wonder like children. A long time ago, the Egyptians and the Israelites lived side by side in Egypt. And although they had different beliefs, they lived together quite happily. Then a bad king came to power. He made the Israelites work as slaves and ordered that every baby born to an Israelite family must be thrown into the Nile River. An Israelite woman had a newborn baby boy. To keep her baby boy safe, she made a basket from bulrushes and hid the baby inside it by the river. Her daughter waited close by to see what would happen. And the baby was not found by the king, but by an Egyptian princess who was down at the river bathing. But the princess was kind, and she decided to keep the child as a secret from the king. She told her maid to find someone to look after the baby. The maid found the baby's own mother. "Nurse this baby for me, and I will pay you," said the princess. The mother happily agreed to nurse the baby. When the child grew older, the princess adopted him and named him Moses. Wonder like children, but read like adults. And it's a sweet story, even if it contains some factual errors, but we're also called to read like adults. And there's some very adult-like truths that we're going to discover. Reading like adults means that we keep our eyes open for the larger themes that weave its way through. We keep our eyes open to see Jesus. And reading like adults also mean that we don't skip over the tough stuff. And there's some tough stuff in this story. Brutal oppression, racism, slave labor, a deadly river, defiance, dishonesty, the murder of babies, wholesale genocide, and an impossible kind of decision for a desperate mom. And our story starts out in verse 8 with trouble on the horizon. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. How very typical of human politics. A new king, a new pharaoh, a new president comes into power, and all the old allegiance just go out the window. With these ominous words, God's chosen people would move from prosperity to persecution. The land of Egypt, which had been a promising place to lay down roots, had become a nation of bondage and servitude. But God had never intended Egypt to be the promised place. He had a much different plan for that. And on his deathbed, Joseph had actually given a prophecy, a prediction. And this is what he said: God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because that was the promise, that was the deal that God had made with his people. And we're going to watch today as God steps in and the story of redemption marches on. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. So this marks a turning point yet again as God prepares his people to step forward in faith. So the story continues. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they'll become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. And like most tyrants down through history, this Pharaoh has a streak of paranoia and insecurity. And while it was true that the nation of Israel continued to grow dramatically, Pharaoh was really just looking for an excuse. The evangelist Billy Sunday once said that an excuse is a skin of a reason stuffed with a lie. Pharaoh was beating the drum of fear and war to his people to exact a program of genocide on an ethnic group that he wanted to control. Nothing new here. In the sad human history of racism, we've heard all of this before. And Pharaoh's leaders and his people they were only too glad to answer the dog whistle. And here it is. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So from Pharaoh's perspective, this solved both his immigrant problem and his labor shortage problem. Beaten and weary, God's chosen people would have no energy to rebel against Egypt. And it solved a labor problem as two very large and prominent cities were built in record time. And you'll notice that Pharaoh was trying to really strike a balance here. He wanted to be rid of some of the Israelites, but not all of them. And there's an abundance of historical records regarding the barbaric cruelty of the Egyptians. Slaves at the time were the property of Pharaoh. They were literally branded with his seal. And when they were separated from their families, and they were placed in concentration camps where they were forced to labor in the fields or in building. This is an actual depiction, and it comes from a tomb from about the same time period. And it depicts all stages of mud brick making, including the depiction of the slave master holding a rod and an inscription that reads, "The rod is in my hand, be not idle." But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. Where else have we heard about God's people multiplying and spreading? Be fruitful and multiply. That was a command and a promise made to God's people at creation. I will make you a great nation. That was a promise of God to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is also a theme that really marches all the way through the Bible. So even under brutal oppression, the chosen people faithfully grow as a nation. When the king realized that captivity and harsh labor was doing nothing to put the Israelites under his control, that in fact their population was growing by leaps and bounds, it was time for plan B. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose name were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. And so we have the midwives, and they're drafted in to the killing plan. Plan B was actually destined to fail as well. And we'll note that this is the first overt mention of God in our passage today. And what we read is this, that the midwives feared God. So they disobeyed direct orders from Pharaoh. I think it's interesting. Clearly, they had all kinds of reasons why they should fear Pharaoh, yet they disobeyed because they feared God more. And maybe we can press pause for a moment on this point. For some of us who have followed Jesus for some time, maybe the idea of fearing God is familiar and it doesn't cause us to pause. But if you're maybe just putting the pieces together, if you're still thinking about what it might mean like to follow Jesus, I suspect this may be a little confusing. Because one of the things you've certainly heard about God is that God is love. And that seems to be in such opposition to fearing God. There's a passage in the second half of our Bible called the New Testament in a book called Hebrews that I think will help us understand what's meant here. "Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful, and so worship God acceptably and with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire." The author is encouraging us to worship God acceptably, because we are part of his redemption story. We are receiving his kingdom, and because God rules and reigns in that kingdom, there's an acceptable way to approach God. And that's with reverence and awe. That's what's meant by fearing God. And so with these two Hebrew midwives, we get our first glimpse of how God shows up in a more subtle way, in a way that I would maintain can be true for us as well. And it all centers around an awareness of the promises of God. It centers on an awareness that these captives in Egypt shared with people like Adam and Eve and Noah, Abraham and Isaac, and really all of us, that God truly steps in and the story of redemption marches on. These two women, and likely many more Hebrew midwives, defied the king because they knew the promises of God. They knew they were part of the saving story. No over-the-top appearances of God here, no vision or voice from God. This is how I would describe how God showed up. If you're a note taker, write this down. God shows up in the faith of his people. A faith that believes God is who he says he is. A faith that says, I believe what God promises to do, and he'll do it. These women believed God. They feared God because they were rooted in the promises of God. But fearing God and not fearing a king, well, it has consequences in the real world. So we read this. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? And the midwives answered Pharaoh, well, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Pharaoh's plan is falling apart again. He summons the midwives to demand an answer, but what he gets is an insult and a lie. An insult because the insinuation is that Egyptian women are weaker and more helpless than Hebrew women. And a lie, well, because it was a lie. No matter how you slice it, there was a purposeful deception here. Because the truth would have gone something like this. Well, Your Royal Highness, it turns out that killing baby boys is just plain wrong. And I fear God more than I fear you. The outcome of that would have been predictable. They wouldn't have lived another day to save babies. Shiphrah and Puah are really the heroes in this story. They did what they did in the interest of preserving life and love. And in doing so, they saved many lives, including the life of our baby hero Moses that would go on eventually to save his people. But more importantly, as we'll see, it was pleasing to God. So our story continues. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. God was kind to the midwives, and the people were blessed. And not only God was kind to the midwives, but he rewarded and he blessed the midwives by giving them families of their own. This passage reinforces our premise that God shows up in the faith of his people. And although the king has let the Hebrew midwives off the hook, he's not done with God's chosen people. He actually has plan C, and this is it. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. And I know this is hard to read, but it's a necessary reminder that from the very first story in the garden, there's been an enemy amongst us. That there are spiritual descendants of the serpent in the garden. So genocide is in full swing. Pharaoh now has enlisted his entire country into his murderous plot, and baby boys are being thrown into the Nile River, filled with the notorious Nile crocodile. So here's the deal. These guys really don't look that notorious, do they? Smiling crocodiles, huh? So why just the boys and not the girls? Remember, the king's plan was to command and control his nation. He still needed the slave labor. He just wanted to lessen the threat. And more importantly, I think he wanted to give a blow to the morale of God's people. And it was in the middle of this treacherous time for God's people that a young couple did an amazingly hopeful thing. They got married, and they had a baby. Now, a man from the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Hope and courage. Because you can imagine the worry and the anxiety that was there as they awaited the birth of this child, knowing that if it was a son, his life would be in peril. And then every hour of every day as they hid him, worrying that he would be discovered. And so desperate times call for desperate measures. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, and she coated it with tar and pitch. And then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. We have a desperate mom making a desperate decision. And we have a worried sister waiting off into the side to see what would happen as baby Moses is put in the Nile. It's an agonizing choice. As the child became so active and noisy to be hidden, it's an impossible choice for a mom to place her child in the river where countless boys had met their end. An amazing act of faith and hope that somehow, some way, God would intervene and save her baby. Listen, at some point in the history, God's plan for redemption was floating down the Nile River. All right, it's time for a pop quiz. You guys ready? A month ago, we studied the story of Noah's Ark. Do you remember what the word ark meant in the original language? Where's my nerds? I'll let you off the hook. The word translated to ark means a sarcophagus or a sacred shrine. In Egypt, it described a storage container for idols. And we discovered in the case of Noah's Ark, God placed not idols, but humankind made in his image. And the ark became a means of redemption for the faithful remnant. God steps in, remember, and the story of redemption marches on. The word used for ark is an unusual word, and it's actually borrowed from the Egyptians, and it shows up exactly twice in all of Scripture. Noah's Ark, and where else? Right here in our story. This basket made of papyrus, same word. In faith, the mother of Moses placed him in an ark. And both arks represent the very same thing, God's means of saving humanity. Noah's Ark saved a righteous remnant from God's judgment on humanity. Moses' ark saved the man who would lead their nation to safety. And both arks are all about salvation, saving those God loves. They were life preservers for everyone on board. And because it's a means of saving his people, then this certainly points to Jesus and the ultimate ark, which is the cross of Jesus Christ. The cross is the rescue for all those who are sinking in the sea of moral mess-ups. Only the cross of Jesus Christ will get you through the rough waters of sin to the other side with eternity with God. And so the ark with baby Moses is set afloat in the Nile River. And notice that the older sister of Moses is keeping an eye out to see what would happen. Not to intervene, but simply to observe what happens. And it doesn't look good. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slaves to get it. She opened it up and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Pharaoh's daughter, of all people. Moses floating down the river into the arms of the enemy. But faith in our sovereign God means that God can show up in the most unlikely ways. God can even show up in the hearts of our persecutors. And God does show up. God does provide a way when there seemed to be no other way. And this is what it looked like. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Well, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's own mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. In a conclusion that's filled with all kinds of irony, we see faithful people like the midwives, Moses' parents and sister, and even Pharaoh's daughter, all playing a part in God's saving story. The fingerprints of God are all over this story. You just need to know where to look. All these acts of faith, they work together in concert to place the man Moses in the perfect place at the perfect time to fulfill God's plan to rescue and redeem his people. It's critically important to know and to trust in God's promises to his people. The Hebrews knew they were part of a story much greater than themselves. It's what allowed them to move in faith. So do you remember the questions that we started out with today? Does God care about your golf game? Or finding a rock? Does God care about and at times intervene in the smallest details of our lives? How does our story and God's story intersect? Are we part of God's redemption story? Now, if your answer is yes, or if you desperately want to believe that the answer is yes, then it's all about a step of faith. Faithfulness is how we become part of his story. And it's staggering to think that we as deeply flawed, broken people are invited to be part of his story. The God who put the universe into motion, who breathed the stars into existence, desires you to be part of his story for his glory. And the promises of God are clear. You are a chosen person, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. You are a person that belongs to God. In every experience that you go through, God is at work in your life. And while it may seem like you're stuck or you're waiting or you're forgotten, God's word says that you're part of the greatest story ever told. If you've already given your allegiance to Jesus, then his call to you is clear. Walk in faith according to his promises. If you're here today and you're putting the pieces together of faith, if the evidence has convinced you and you feel God pulling you towards himself right now, I invite you to step into his story today. It's a story that's spanned thousands of years, but the story isn't complete without you. If that's you, in a moment, I'm going to pray. And I invite you to pray along with me right where you're sitting. Say yes to moving your allegiance to Jesus. Say yes to making him the authority of your life. Say yes to being part of his story. Join me in prayer. Jesus, I am desperately tired of my mess-ups. I'm truly sorry for the ways that I continually fall short. And today I desire to exchange my sins for the promises of the cross. Jesus, I trust in your promises, and I take this step forward in faith to follow you, to put my entire life under your authority.